There's continuity to the history of technological transformations, Darton suggests, and what is ever present is the experience of rupture. Anthony Grafton, another historian of the book, makes a similar point in his excellent little book, Codex in Crisis. He writes, "The current drive to digitize the written record is one of a number of critical projects in the very long saga of our drive to accumulate, store, and retrieve information efficiently. It will result not in the infotopia that the prophets conjure up, but in one more of a series of new information ecologies, all of them challenging, in which readers, writers, and producers of text have learned to survive and flourish." Now, if this point lingers, I think it's because one of its implications is that technological innovation, whether the printing press, the telegraph, the television, or a digital device, though it delivers information in a new form, is not necessarily the root cause of controversies about reading and writing that have arisen in its wake. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about a meltdown, one that's occurring not on Wall Street, but on what I refer to as Grub Street. And it's worth stressing that, while the problems of Grub Street are matters of pretty big cultural importance, they're pretty slight compared to the hardships that have befallen millions of people thanks to Wall Street and other political and economic factors. It's important to have a sense of proportion about all of this. Now, on Grub Street, for nearly a decade, and especially during the past 3 years, people have been wailing and otherwise voicing their displeasure over the deterioration of book coverage in the United States. During some of this talk, I'm going to discuss newspaper book coverage because, rightfully or not, it has long been regarded as an accurate barometer of the delicate ecology of literary life. I mean, who hasn't lost count of the number of times they've heard someone in a bookstore say, "Do you have that novel that the Times raved about?" I'm also going to talk about publishing literary journalism at a print magazine in the current economic and cultural climate, and I'd love to take questions on that afterwards. It's what I know best. Frankly, I think there's no better time than right now to be covering books and ideas, especially since the reigning assumption, which is one I do not share, is that digital technology has turned the landscape upside down and that print is dead. I mean, if you can't take chances now, if in such a climate you cannot seek an heir both legitimate and rare, then when can you? I mean, there's no herd to follow, so there's no better time to take chances. That a steep erosion in newspaper book coverage has occurred is undeniable. Newspapers that have killed or reduced book coverage during the past few years include the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Newsday, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the Boston Globe, the Memphis Commercial Appeal, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Dallas Morning News, the Sun-Sentinel, the New Mexican, the Village Voice, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, just to name a very, very few. Jobs have vanished and lives have been upended. But this decline, though precipitous, is not at all recent. With the exception of The Nation, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, and Harper's, weekly magazines began rolling back their book coverage in the 1990s. As for newspapers, there's no better example of the long contraction than the New York Times Book Review. When the critic and novelist John Leonard was editing the Book Review in the 1970s, an era generally regarded as that publication's golden age, on some Sundays he could count on having 80 pages to work with, which is astonishing. In 1985, the Book Review averaged 44 pages. In the mid-1990s, it averaged 36, and in recent months, it has been averaging 24 to 28. It's still the country's most visible newspaper book section, but there's just not much to read in it anymore. Some questions, then, to serve as boundary stones for the ramble ahead. Is it true, as many people who have commented on the matter have claimed, that the recent decline in newspaper book coverage is a problem for the culture at large, and also representative of larger cultural problems? Are review sections disappearing or shrinking because they can't turn a profit? Or is it because they can't compete with material originating on the internet? Why are weekly and monthly magazines, despite producing a glut of thoughtful essays and reviews about books, generally left out of the conversation about book coverage? Can quality book coverage, by which I mean not reviewery, but scrutiny, the deliberate, measured analysis of literary and intellectual questions without obvious or easy answers, Can such coverage originate online and also find a loyal audience there? And finally, are today's complaints about the inadequacy of book coverage really all that different from the darts thrown at book reviewers since the beginning of the 18th century? As Gail Poole writes in her book Faint Praise, The Plight of Book Reviewing in America, for 2 centuries, book reviews have been lambasted by critics, often reviewers themselves, who have complained that reviews are profligate in their praise, hostile in their criticism, inaccurate, illiterate, or just plain dull. Now, has it always been thus? So I want to talk a little about newspapers. The newspaper that many of us, or many of our parents, grew up reading was a product of the sweet spot of the 20th century, the post-war boom. By mid-century, the occupation of news gathering had been thoroughly professionalized. And during the following 3 decades, abundant ad revenue enabled newspapers to expand their newsroom and to increase the quality and quantity of news coverage. Between 1964 and 1999, the volume of news published by some metropolitan papers doubled. The dimensions of the news changed as well. As Leonard Downey and Michael Judson explained recently in the Columbia Journalism Review, during the boom, newspapers began to gravitate away from a long-standing preoccupation with government and with pegging coverage to specific political events. They still covered those beats, but they also began to cultivate what Judson and Downey call a much broader understanding of public life that included not just events, but also patterns and trends. And not just in politics, but also in science, medicine, business, sports, education, religion, culture, and entertainment. In some cases, newspaper editors were reacting to the lessons of the civil rights and women's movements. Politics isn't the exclusive domain of white men. The personal is political. In other cases, editors were reacting to changes in the media market. They needed to slow or reverse the loss of readers turning to broadcast or cable television for their news coverage, or to magazines that offered depth instead of breadth. Or they needed to remain relevant to readers whose news diet had changed since they had left the city for the suburbs. And so newspapers endeavored to broaden their reader base by adding or expanding coverage of business, sports, health, real estate, food, and film, and books as well. There are 2 examples that I think really drive this point home. One is the Los Angeles Times Book Review, which was launched as a 12-page Sunday supplement in 1975. The Washington Post Book World is the other. It debuted as a Sunday tabloid section in the 1960s. It was folded into the paper in the 1970s and then resurrected again as a standalone book section in the early 1980s. And neither of those sections exists today as a standalone Sunday tabloid. The New York Times Book Review is not a boomer, but a centenarian. It has been a section of the paper since Adolph Ochs bought the Times in 1896. Nevertheless, the rest of the Times is a boomer. In the early 1970s, managing editor Abe Rosenthal sectioned the paper to expand arts, science, and business coverage and to introduce ad-friendly service sections, and that's generally the paper we are still reading. Although newspapers remain the country's prime source of news, in print or online, as we know, their economic base has been undermined by the internet. In some cases, it has also been undermined by a newspaper becoming a publicly traded company, and therefore being beholden to shareholders who want 10 or 15% returns. The digital realm's pernicious culture of free and low-cost web advertising have broken the grip of newspapers on audience and advertisers. Newspapers began losing national and retail advertising with the advent of broadcast television. As a response, they doubled down on classified advertising. During the last decade, they lost much of their classified advertising, as we know, to websites like Craigslist. Now, what they did was, as we also know, instead of charging for news online, newspapers decided to pillage themselves and offered news for free as a way to attract audiences and advertisers. There was an uptick in ad revenue in the early to mid-2000s, but it leveled off with the recession. And even at its peak, the tiny sums from online ads fell well